cast no shadow, there is hope. Should oceans rise and mountains fall, he never fails. So take heart, let his love lead us through the night, and hold on to hope, and take courage again. Death by love, the fallen world was overcome. He wears the scars of our freedom in his name. And all our fears are swept away. He never fails. So take on his love lead us through the night, and hold on to hope, and take courage again. I know he sees us. Oh, he surrounds us. All the world and its troubles, take heart, for he has overcome. All the world and its troubles, take heart, our God has overcome. All the world and its troubles, take heart, for he has overcome. All the world and its troubles, take heart, our God has overcome. All the world and its troubles, take heart, for he has overcome. All the world and its troubles, take heart, our God has overcome. All the world and its troubles, take heart, for he has overcome. All the world and its troubles, oh, God I trust in, God I pray, oh, has overcome. He has overcome. He reigns. Oh, God is with us. God is with us. He has overcome. God our freedom.
He has overcome.
God our refuge and our strength.
God is with us.
All the world and its troubles, take heart, our God has overcome. You gave me hope, you made me whole at the cross. the sun. Age to age, he shines. Oh, look to the skies, hear the angels cry, singing, holy is the Lord. You gave me hope, you made me whole at the cross. You took my place, you showed me grace at the cross where you died for me, and his glory appears like the light from the sun. Age to age, he shines. Oh, look to the skies, hear the angels cry, singing, holy is the Lord. And his glory appears like the light from the sun. Age to age, he shines. Oh, look to the skies, hear the angels cry, singing, holy is the Lord, singing, holy is the Lord. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Westside, our February menu is in full swing, and here's a few things to highlight. First is that we have short circles, which are a short-term intentional gathering that are designed to bring us together and help foster community, friendship, and energy for life. They're happening online and are facilitated by WKC leaders. Check out the options and find one or more that is right for you by heading to wkc.org/menu. The Big Read is still happening. You can pick up Rich Viota's deeply formed life book as we journey together with it. We're also introducing what we're calling the Big Watch. Make a plan with family and watch an episode weekly through this film series found on Right Now Media. Right Now Media is free for everyone and available on our website. This year, we invite you to start the journey of Lent and join with Ash Wednesday at home. Register and you can pick up, or we will deliver a service kit to your home that contains all that you need to lead your house in this annual service from the Christian calendar. We'll provide music to listen to, prayers, readings, and devotions to participate in so that you can start a new tradition in your own space. Register at wkc.org/menu. And lastly, the Sanctuary course begins Monday, February 8th and is continuing to discover the common language of mental health, stigma, self-care, and more. To register for the Sanctuary and for all other program information, go to wkc.org/menu.
Today, I want to talk to you about sexual wholeness, particularly in the context of this book that we're working through, in the fact that we live in a world that separates our bodies from our souls. So there's a kind of way of saying it then that says to understand sex, we're going to have to understand the human story of disconnection. Now, in the Bible, to understand that, you begin in one very specific place, and that's in the Genesis story. Now, we've been into the Genesis story already in this series, and it's quite important if we're going to understand our lives that we drop back into this story. Now, for a lot of people, the Genesis story is quite controversial space because we get caught up in these arguments about whether this story is true, whether this story is scientific. And if you want to have those stories and those conversations, then I'm okay with that. But what I want to say for us today is simply this, that the truth of these stories are found in the theological and narrative shaping power that they have for us to understand the kind of story the Bible's telling. Like we see in Genesis 1 and chapter 2, we see that God's life-creating power is producing something good. This is a theological comment that is being made about the creation. So the Bible sets up right from the beginning that what we've got here, what God's doing in us, was intended to be good. Now, in part 3 of our series, we talked about this Genesis story and how humanity kind of functions in a sort of mirroring relationship, where humanity, they basically, our role as humans is to mirror the worship of creation to God and mirror God's love to creation. So this is the kind of relationship that we are being set up. And that word's quite important. It's being set up as a relationship, that what God makes, he's in relationship with, and God's creation is in relationship with the rest of creation. And God calls all of this good. And then we get to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18. And the text reads like this at this point. It says, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him.'" And this is the beginning of this creation of these two characters we know as Adam and Eve. God says it is not good. First time we hear that in the Bible. It is not good for Adam to be alone. I will make a helper for him. And all the chauvinists at this point, they hear this word helper as this description of Eve, and they think about washing and cleaning and stuff like that. But the Hebrew word etzer isn't helper in the way that we've patronized this term, but rather God is saying here that he wants to make an ally, a partner for Adam. In fact, this word etzer appears elsewhere in the Bible to describe a warrior. It's the kind of helper that you would take into a battle. God himself is described as a helper. So then, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 21 and 22, the text continues. "So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. And then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man." So hold that story in your mind just for a second. It may, if it's the first time you've heard that story, it feels really far-fetched. But let's not worry about that too much. Let's just think about what's being told to us in that story. While you're holding that there, let me just say this. The English words sex and sexuality derive from the Latin word secar, which literally means to cut off, to sever, to disconnect. So when we describe something sex, when we describe the sex of something, we're talking about the disconnect. Sex and sexuality come from a word that means to cut off, to disconnect. The Hebrew Bible tells a story about the creation of male and female. But think about how that story went. It was a story of disconnection. That from one, the disconnection created another. But the writer of the Hebrew Bible isn't finished yet. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, just a few verses later, it says this, and that, referring to this story we've just told, is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. And that's how the text reads. So we get this story about Adam, the story about Adam's loneliness and the sense that it was not good that he was alone. God then separates from Adam Eve, and then the writer throws in this little line and says, oh, and by the way, that's why marriage happens. That's why husbands leave their parents and become one flesh with their wife. And then it throws in this other line, oh, and by the way, Adam and Eve, they were naked and they felt no shame. That's like a kind of very Hebrew way of saying, hint, hint, you kind of know what's going on here. So when you read the Genesis creation story, like, is it a story about creation or is it a story about sex? Or is the answer both? Because fascinatingly, the first thing that the humans do when sexed is, or disconnected, perhaps is a better way to say that right now, the first thing they do is find a way to reconnect. Think about the story again. God separates Eve from Adam, and then the very next thing we encounter is, and this is why they come back together again. They were disconnected, now they are reconnected. But the story doesn't end there. In the very next chapter, sin enters the world. And this creation that God's put together, which was good, now starts to become corrupted. The very next thing we find in the story is they're kind of exited from the garden that they're in. So the place where it all began becomes a place they can no longer be. So by chapter 3, disconnection and disorder are now the name of the story. God himself comes to meet Adam and Eve, and he says, where are you? Because they're hidden from him. They're disconnected. As the kind of effects of this sin work its way out, the writer tells us that women are told that they will find themselves in conflict with men, that men are told they will find themselves in conflict with the earth and with everything else. When all of this was together in relationship, and that relationship included sexual relationships, God calls it good. But then disconnect happened, the falling apart happens, the sin enters the story, and it ends up in a mess. So is this story true? Perhaps a better question is this story still true? It's not so much whether this story happened, but it's about whether this story is constantly happening. Like, are we disconnected? Are we disconnected from the earth? Are we disconnected from each other? Are we disconnected from God? As it's been said before, we live in our air-conditioned houses and air-conditioned office and air-conditioned cars while we hold Zoom meetings. Like, are we disconnected from what's going on around us? Are we disconnected from ourselves? So we enter the world as babies with a cry that comes from disconnection. And there's an ache that I think is deep within all of us, that we are aware that we are disconnected from each other in different ways. But the Hebrew Bible story, what it does, which is fascinating, is it connects our sexuality and our need for connection to our spirituality. Both of them are driven by our innate desire to connect with one another. Think about spirituality, the desire to connect and understand our world and the God who is beyond it, a longing to know and be known by God, whether that's psychologically or spiritually or physically or emotionally, as Deborah Hirsch would say. But then think about your sexuality. Is it not also the desire to connect and understand those who are not ourselves? A longing to know and be known by another, whether it's on a physical level, an emotional level, a psychological level, or even a spiritual level. So sexuality and spirituality perhaps belong together. Maybe a deeply formed sexuality understands this. But Christianity on one hand and our society on the other hand have always struggled to understand what deeply formed sexuality might look like. We get caught in two extremes. On one end, overemphasizing sexuality, or on the other side, overemphasizing spirituality. Rob Bell, in a book on the subject, talks about how this is about like the divide between animals and angels. On the one hand, there's this idea out there that our sexual impulses are basically just human desires that we cannot and perhaps should not fight. This is not a new idea. You find in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, when Paul is talking to the Corinthians in verse 13, he brings out this quote from Corinth in its time. The quote was, "Food for the stomach and stomach for food." It basically was a way of just saying, stuff is what stuff is for, so use it for that. And it was a kind of way of just saying, just whatever you do with your body, that's totally fine. And that idea from first century Corinth is still present in our culture today. This idea, we just badge it differently. We talk about freedom. We talk about living honestly with our desires. We talk about natural states. Actually, if you think about it, that way that we talk about sex in our contemporary culture, which we describe as freedom, is really a sort of low-grade despair that kind of works from the premise that basically you and I are helpless to do anything against our base instincts. So when somebody comes along and suggests, well, what about restraint or self-control or abstinence? This kind of gets mocked as living in the clouds, sort of unrealistic. Essentially, the basis of our way of thinking about things is that sex is inevitable for us as humans. And if you listen to the language of most conversations about sex, whether in school or even in youth groups and in churches, there's a sense of just, well, it's just the way we are. Rob Bell says it's the fatalism of accepting that we are just animals. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul encourages us really to elevate our thinking. Contrary to the idea that other people exist basically just, to have sex with, Paul calls us to a higher purpose. He says the Holy Spirit resides in us. We are the temple of God. So we're not just simply our basic urges, but there's much deeper, more profound levels to us if we can think beyond that, if we can think above that. The problem is, historic Christianity, which is still present in many, many contexts today, perhaps even in our own lives, it just went a little too far with that. And essentially ended up trying to ask us all to act like angels, to sort of deny our physical sensibilities. And it kind of failed to acknowledge that we as humans are sexual beings. So as a result, within Christianity, I'm not exaggerating to say we never talk about sex. It's not the conversation that you'll find. We don't really talk about it with our kids. We don't talk about it with our friends, and you never talk about it in church. Essentially, for a lot of our history, the attempt has been to turn sexuality off. Sex is purely procreative. If it's not for making babies, it perhaps shouldn't be happening. It's as if we're trying to pretend to be angels. In fact, I was reading the transcript of an interview with a character who said this. He said, I was raised, and think about this as we read this. This is what the guy said. I was raised in a setting in which sex was for procreation only, and the rest was sin. He said, our family was prohibitionist, Puritan in a very real sense. We never hugged. Oh, no. There was absolutely no hugging or kissing in my family. There was a point in time when my mother, later in life, apologized to me for not being able to show affection. That was, of course, the way I'd been raised. So I said to her, Mom, you couldn't have done it any better. And because of the things you weren't able to do, It set me on a course that changed my life and the world. The interview was with Hugh Hefner, the founder of the Playboy empire. He grew up being asked to be like an angel, and you probably know where the story goes from there. Because whether angels or animals, these extremes of our perspective of who we are will leave us in bad space. In space that the Genesis story would call not good. So let's return back to that story for a minute. In this creation narrative, there are animals in this creation narrative, but notably, they are not made in the image of God. The animals are made, they're created, but it's humans that are made in the image of God. The animals are made, and the kind of sense is that what you take from that is that they're not what we'd call conscious. They don't have spirituality. Let me put it like this. Dogs don't worry about whether dogs go to heaven. So animals have bodies, but they don't have spirits. But on the other side, angels, the Bible tells us, are spirits that don't have bodies. In fact, Jesus makes a point in one of his teachings that angels don't marry and aren't given in marriage. Animals don't have spirits. Angels don't have bodies. But in the middle of God's creation, we have humans. Humans have spirits and bodies. And God calls them good. So the role of the human is to find the dimensions of sexuality that are both human and spiritual. And if we don't get those two in tension, we end up looking in the wrong places to understand and work out our sexuality. So denying sexual desire can not only be torturous, but be a very dark path. We only need to look at the horrendous stories of sexual abuse in churches across the years that convince us of that. But then the other side, assuming that sex is the place to outwork all of your desires, is also unhealthy. When we reduce our spirituality and sexuality down to simply having sex, then what happens is we go looking for belonging and acceptance and love, only to discover, as Viodas tells us in his book, that we have been vulnerable with someone to meet a need that didn't require you to take your clothes off. We start trying to solve everything with the wrong thing. And so the Genesis story then, and the reason we want to spend our time in this story, it offers us two combined aspects of sexuality that are profoundly important to us. On the first aspect, it tells us about the social intra-human connection that happens in human sexuality. Sex with another person forms deep bonds. It needs deep bonds. It requires that. Notice that the text says that this is why a person leaves their parents and is now with their partner. Now think about what it's saying there. This is not something that just happens fleetingly, but the sexual relationship between Adam and Eve is life-changing. It moves and adjusts. It requires commitment from them. The image of God that's imprinted into all of us longs for fellowship, and it longs for connection, and it longs for something that lasts, and that's what's going on here. But then the second aspect of this sexuality is actually having sex. It's there in the biblical text. They were naked and they knew no shame. Like there's vulnerability in that sentence there. But the vulnerability can happen because of the previous sentence, that there's a committed relationship going on to form all of this. Viodas says that it's not just about our bodies colliding with each other. It's an act of self-giving, mutually indwelling love that points to something beyond ourselves. Sex doesn't narrow everything down. It creates something deeper and bigger. And the Genesis vision then is that sex is sustained by marriage. That's how they two work. The husband leaves his previous way of life and is now joined with his wife. And that's the context that the vulnerability of sex happens in. And that's profound and significant for us because in that structure, there's no shame, there's no comparison, there's no objectification. And in a world that seems to spend a whole host of its time in body shame, body comparison, and body objectification, this dream of the Bible's might look quite attractive. Because there's something more going on in this story than just bodies. It's not that they didn't have bodies, it's that there's a deeper element happening. There's connection and there's commitment. But of course, you know chapter 3 of Genesis is coming, and the story does fall apart. Sin enters the world. Alongside sin, what we also find is shame. Notice it, they hide from God instantly, and they also hide themselves from each other. When we see Adam and Eve for the first time after everything falls apart, they're covering their nakedness with fig leaves. They're hiding from where God is. Sexuality has become disrupted, but so also has spirituality. And in fact, even marriage, the structure which is to sustain this relationship, has become impacted and broken as a result. And I think that's why we need to look at this powerful image of human sexuality in the Genesis narrative. Because what it does is it describes to us the dream of what it is we're looking for and the reason for why the world doesn't look like that, why it looks so different. But it also explains how we encounter the world of sexuality now. Like we're looking for vulnerability and connection in our sexual lives. In our sexuality, that's what we desire, a safe space to be vulnerable and to connect with somebody who will accept us for who we are. And I think if you think about it, most sexual disruption is connected to these issues of vulnerability and the desire for belonging with someone. Think about pornography and all of the connected industry to that. There's no vulnerability happens in that sexual expression. There's nothing to make it last beyond that one encounter. And this is true of the kind of no-tie sexual encounters that happen, regularly, the friends with benefits, the sort of fast food approach to sex, or perhaps the engaging with sex workers and prostitution. All of these are attempts to work out our sexual desire, but not our sexuality, because sexuality calls us to vulnerability. They were naked and they knew no shame. But the other side of that, it's also an attempt to avoid vulnerability if we try and run away and escape our desires completely. The creation story gives us structures and contexts within which to safely work out our vulnerability and sexuality in healthy ways. The humanity and the spirituality of Genesis calls us to pursue a sexuality that's deeper than simple animal behavior, but also a healthy attitude towards our bodies and the bodies of others, because it invites us into unity, commitment, and communion. So, what might be some practices and habits that we might need to guide us into a deeply formed aspect of our sexuality? For many years now, I've always encouraged people in a particular way regarding their sexuality and sex specifically. And it involves asking a very simple question that I'd love you to think about. The question is simply this: what is the story you're trying to tell? What story is your life working out? What is your life telling about you? What is your sexual behavior saying about you? Let me ask the question about this story a different way around. Imagine yourself one day as a grandparent, and your grandchild is perhaps sat on your knee, and your grandchild says to you, "How did you meet Grandma? Tell me the story of that." The question I would ask then is, how much will you lie? Like, how much will you tell the truth of the story you've been living? Is the way you're working out your sexuality something that you feel you would want to tell? And then perhaps spend some time examining what might prevent your honesty. What stories are there in there that you'd rather not have? Perhaps terrible things have happened to you. Well, I encourage you, reach out have somebody journey and help you with that. Or perhaps you've got some badly formed ideas about what sex is. Well, reach out and help somebody, get somebody to help you with that as well. Another thing that we can do in the process of working through our story is then start to name the deformed sexual messages that we live with. Like, we learn about sex from all the wrong places. Whether it's terribly bad parental talks that some of you may have been exposed to, or whether it's the things you learn in the schoolyard, or weird ideas from a youth pastor that barely understood the subject themselves, or the internet, or pornography, or just terrible experiences you've had sexually. Like, what are the lies and illusions that we've believed about our sexuality and sex in general? Like, the gospel tells us that we are loved regardless of whether or not we have sex with someone. The gospel tells us that our identity is in surrender to grace and not in how many sexual conquests we've had. The other thing I want to encourage you to think about is how, as you tell your story just to yourself, how might you broaden your connections? The creation story in Genesis speaks to our need to be connected, to be in life-giving relationships. But that's not just sexual relationships, that's friendships and small groups or the likes. And I think our bad culture of relationships that kind of thinks of most relationships in some sort of, kind of sexual trajectory, combined with our reduction of sexuality to just sex, mean that we often have too few relationships trying to carry all of the pressure. I think this is why sometimes churches have just really bad cultures of singleness, because we're heaping everything onto one relationship. And finally, assuming some sort of committed lifelong union, which we would often refer to as marriage, actually practice sex. Like, the reductions of sexuality and a Hollywood pornography culture have added anxiety and fear to having sex with your husband or your wife. But engaging with the Genesis story, and it's in there if you'll look, reminds you that at some point a husband and a wife come together and nobody really knows what they're doing. But there's a whole life of commitment in which to learn. So this story reminds us that there's time and space to practice, but also that if what we've said about sexuality, if you believe it, if you buy into it, then your sexuality is much bigger than just what happens in the bedroom, if you know what I mean. It's about the journey of your sexuality, your spirituality, your humanity, which is all of this, together into those moments when someone has sex with the person that they're committed to. Like, there is much more that could be said about this. Like, whenever I talk about sex, everybody, well, not everybody, but people often email me afterwards and they're like, well, what about this and what about that? And I get that we've not covered half the things we could want to talk about in a sermon like this. But the invitation today is to try and work out our sexuality as community of Jesus followers, to work it out in a way that's deeply formed as part of our bigger discipleship. Let's avoid the temptation to be the police and the law, but rather to be models of healthy humanity in everything that we do, including our spirituality and also our sexuality. And may in all of this, you remember that God's grace and peace is with you.
Take me by the hand and walk with me by quiet streams. I need to hear the wind and feel the ground beneath my feet. You're the only friend who can set my soul at ease. And in the quiet pride of my Father's eyes, I remember who I am. And when I feel the warmth of Father's smile, know that I've been born again. I've been born again. And realign my heart and help me keep the first things first. And let me hear your whisper, and God, I hang on every word. 'Cause you're the only friend who can set my soul at ease. In the quiet pride of my Father's eyes, I remember who I am. And when I feel the warmth of my Father's smile, feels like I've been born again. I've been born